In the first video about the burden of proof, we saw that the atheist claims that the theist, the God believer, carries the whole burden of proof. But that claim itself needs some kind of proof or strong argument. That means that the atheist has the second order burden of proof to show that the theist has the whole burden of proof in the God debate. We saw that the atheist actually failed to carry this second order burden of proof, and therefore the whole situation collapses back to the original position, where the burden of proof is divided evenly. In this second video, I want to bring up a common redefinition of atheism that is designed to avoid all burden of proof. And I will argue that this redefinition is hardly successful for justifying atheism. So, how could an atheist explain why he or she lacks the burden of proof? One possible explanation is this redefinition of atheism that goes something like this. I don't claim that there is no God. Such a claim would give me a burden of proof. No, I just claim the non-belief in the existence of God. I just don't believe anything about God, which is of course something else, and gives me no burden of proof. This might sound confusing, but there is an important difference between believing in God's non-existence, denying the existence of God, that is, versus not believing in God, have no beliefs whatsoever concerning God. This distinction is meaningful and important, and the atheist is using it in order to avoid the burden of proof. But is this a successful move? Let's see. Instead of talking about God, let's talk about aliens for a minute. Imagine that you talk to someone who never even heard about the idea of aliens. Maybe you have a great-grandfather isolated in the countryside, not reading the newspapers, not watching TV for the last 50 years or so, and definitely not reading any science fiction books whatsoever. He would not believe in aliens because he has never even heard of the idea. He doesn't believe in aliens, but he doesn't deny their existence either. He just lacks any beliefs about aliens, one way or the other. In the same way, some has claimed that atheism just is non-belief in God. It's just lacking any beliefs about God whatsoever. Even, of course, lacking belief in God's non-existence. Such a total lack of beliefs concerning God will in practical life be equal to atheism. Such a person will not pray to God, not even curse God. God will be totally absent from that person's thought life. Does such person has a burden of proof in regard to the question of God's existence? Of course not. That person isn't claiming anything about God and lacks therefore any burden of proof in that regard. But is it reasonable to call such a person an atheist? If that is what atheism means, the newly born babies are atheists as well as dogs and stones, since they lack any beliefs or any ideas of God. God's nature, existence, or anything like that. But is it wise to let a word that usually means the active denial of God be equally applicable to babies, animals, and things? Doesn't it run the risk of confusing the picture rather than clarifying it? If this should be called atheism, it should be called atheism number 2 or something else that helps us to distinguish it from ordinary atheism. Actually, this atheism number 2 seems closer to some kind of agnosticism, namely the idea or the stance that you just don't know what to believe about God. But there are at least 2 versions of agnosticism. You have principled agnosticism and personal. Principled agnosticism says that no one can know anything about God. But that's a rather substantive claim, right? The natural question to that kind of agnosticism would be, how can you know that no one can know anything about God? How did you get that knowledge? And how could you know so much about God or the concept of God that you know that no one can know anything about him? In order to know that something is unknowable, you need a lot of knowledge. And that means that you need to be able to give reasons for that knowledge, which means that you have assumed a burden of proof, right? So this kind of agnosticism will not help the atheist to avoid the burden of proof, that is. But there is a personal kind of agnosticism that just says, I don't know. I just don't know. And that is exactly what your great-grandfather would say about aliens. Once you've explained what the word means, of course. Or what an infant would answer about the existence of God, if the infant could speak, that is. So allow me, for all practical purposes, to call this new kind of atheism for agnosticism, personal agnosticism. Now, this brings two questions to mind. First, is it really true that those atheists that claim to be agnostics about God really are agnostics about God? In their heart, don't they harbor the active belief that anything that is similar enough to the God of the Bible or the Quran, or most religious scriptures for that matter, is non-existent? Isn't the talk about lack in belief of God, isn't that just a rhetorical hide-and-seek trick? Just to avoid the burden of proof for the atheism that most such atheists in fact believe in? Isn't it quite dishonest to play this game instead of just honestly come and say, well, I just don't believe there is a God. I believe in God's non-existence. To this, an atheist might respond, well, of course I believe in God's non-existence. But my point is that for all practical purposes, it would be enough for me to just lack belief in God. And I would end up in the same practical life, the same way of thinking as I have now as an active atheist. And this underlines the point that the theist, the person that claims that God exists, has to prove his point to me, or at least to my great-grandfather, assuming that he was just as ignorant about God as he is about aliens. Viewed in this way, this becomes a rhetorical device to say that for all practical purposes, the theist, and not the atheist, or the agnostic, or whatever you call it, has to prove his theism. The burden of proof, practically speaking, is on the theist. Okay, now, this is when it becomes interesting. Let's go back to the aliens and to your great-grandfather. If I visited your great-granddad and explained to him the idea of aliens, and that in fact what we know about the universe shows that it is quite unlikely that intelligent life could have developed somewhere else in the universe, then he could not hide behind his ignorance anymore. He has to say something. His first response will be, well, I don't believe in aliens, but I don't deny their existence either. But after 10 minutes of discussion and fact-sharing, he would most likely say that he now finds it likely that aliens does or doesn't exist. He might still be very uncertain, but he might lean towards one or the other view, right? And after weeks and months, he has learned more, listened to different viewpoints, collected even more arguments, and he might now come to a position he feels a little more sure about. But imagine that instead he stubbornly just claimed that I have no belief about the whole thing, one way or the other. I'm totally agnostic about the whole thing. And everyone who claims something has the burden of proof. That sounds like a stingy old granddad to me. Is it reasonable and honest to put himself outside of the whole discussion by just claiming that he is agnostic, or whatever you want to call it? Instead of claiming this kind of artificial ignorance, it seems much more reasonable to collect whatever knowledge there might be and then make some kind of judgment about the whole, what one finds most plausible, right? But then you believe something. And then you can rightfully be asked to give your reasons for that. And then you admit a degree of burden of proof. As soon as you're taken out of your epistemic innocence, you cannot avoid making some kind of judgment. And then you accept some burden of proof. Well, the second question that this brings to mind is the issue of practical atheism. Let's say that your granddad has no ideas about aliens whatsoever. He is totally agnostic about them, okay? But as soon as he hears about them, it ignites a strong longing in him. He finds the idea emotionally exciting, and he realizes that he would very much like to believe in aliens. He realizes that he has no theoretical reasons to believe in aliens, but at the same time, he lacks any theoretical reasons to deny their existence. And he also lacks any beliefs about plausibilities connecting to the existence or non-existence of aliens. So, since he has this emotional enthusiasm about aliens, he simply chooses to believe in their existence. And then he starts forming beliefs and hopes that it is possible to communicate with them. After all, they might exist. And if so, they might have equipment to hear him. So he starts to pray to aliens on a regular basis. In many practical ways, he is an alien believer, but he realizes that he lacks rational reasons to both believe or to deny the existence of aliens. His belief is solely based on his emotions and his will. Is that rational? This is how many atheists view believers in God. And it might actually be a true picture of at least some believers in God. I doubt that, though. I mean, it's definitely not true of me. I believe I have rational grounds for my belief in God. But let's put that aside. Let's go with the common atheist picture or caricature of believers as being mainly motivated by emotions and wishful thinking. Would that be a rational problem, given this new agnosticism or definition of atheism? Paradoxically, it seems that such an atheism actually gives Granddad reasons to form at least a bunch of weak beliefs about aliens, as long as he doesn't claim to have any good theoretical reasons for his belief. After all, there is no rational grounds against his beliefs in aliens, right? The lesson we learn from this is the following. It's not at all clear that this new definition of atheism gives us reason to accept practical atheism instead of some kind of practical theism. If there are no theoretical reasons whatsoever to deny the existence of aliens or God, it seems that we should be very liberal and allowing in our attitude towards belief in aliens or God. As soon as you start arguing against belief in God, you're assuming a burden of proof. Or, as the saying goes, you can't have the cake and eat it. You can't deny the need for proving practical atheism and still demand that practical theism must be proven. If it is a stalemate, a draw in regards to all theoretical arguments and claims, why not allow people to go on their intuition and wishful thinking, as long as they are aware that they are doing just this? But if so, these practical atheists should be theoretically just as harsh toward theoretical atheists as they are against theoretical theists. And to the degree they aren't, they show that in their heart, they actually are real atheists and nothing else.